Well, my name is Sharon Smith Hoyt, and I was born in Danbury on September 1st, 1941. My parents were both born in Danbury. My father is Edward Smith, and he was born in 1907, and my mother was Anna Renner Smith, and she was born in 1909. I've lived in Danbury for 74 years. My husband's family, my marriage name is Hoyt, and my husband's family was one of the founding families in Danbury.
Oh, wow.
There was Hoyt, Johnson, and Taylor, who came from Norwalk and settled what was then called Swampfield. And from that lineage, that was my husband's family. Now mine, I'm second generation. My grandparents on my father's side were both from Ireland. On my mother's side, her mother was from Ireland and her father was from Austria. I just love Danbury. Danbury will always be home. My husband passed away 3.5 years ago, and I did sell my home in Danbury and bought a condo in Newtown because I could not find one all on one floor in Danbury. But I still go to St. Gregory's Church in Danbury. All my doctors are in Danbury. Danbury is an important part of my life. This is where I'm sure I will die in Danbury, and I know I'll be buried in Danbury. So,
Why don't you tell me a little bit about growing up in Danbury, schools you went to, any fond memories you have?
when I was born, we lived on Town Hill Avenue, which at that time was in the city part of Danbury, because Danbury was both a town and a city at one time, and that was known as the Irish Fourth Ward, and it was predominantly all Irish American people lived in that area. I went to St. Peter's Church and St. Peter's School, and then to Danbury High. And the year that I started freshman year at Danbury High was the year we had the big floods in Danbury. So for 2 weeks of my first month of school at Danbury High, we couldn't get to school. If you lived, depending upon where you lived, the Still River had messed up Main Street and White Street so badly that you couldn't get up or down. Then in my junior and senior year in Danbury High, we were on double sessions because the school had grown, so the town had grown. It was still a town and a city. My dad was on the Board of Education, and I remember the long battles over whether Danbury should have two high schools, one built down at Rogers Park and the other one up on Clappard Ridge. And finally, the Clappard Ridge people that wanted it up there, and that's where it is. Danbury probably should have two high schools. The high school is just way too big. But I graduated from the high school on White Street, and my sister, I have one sister who was older than myself, and she graduated in 1947, 48, in and around that area. We moved from Town Hill to West Street. My father owned a funeral home on West Street, and by that time, I believe my parents thought I was old enough to behave well enough to live in the funeral home. Prior to that, apparently, my behavior was questionable. But I grew up on West Street in a predominantly business professional. Next door to us was a dental office. Several doctors had offices along West Street in that area. So in most cases, they practiced in the home and then lived upstairs the same way my parents did. And at that time, in the funeral home, they were still making drapes and slipcovers. So at a very early age, I learned how to sew, which is something that I still do today. I still sew and enjoy that as a hobby. I graduated from high school, and as many young women do, I married young. Married the boy, my high school sweetheart, and had 4 beautiful children. That marriage lasted for 25 years, and then we went our separate ways. And several years later, I married my second husband, who was Nathan Hoyt, and his family is one of the founding families in Danbury. When Nate and I married, he had 2 children and I had 4. I got married the same year my son got married, which is funny. We had no grandchildren at the time. We have now, my husband passed away 3 years ago, but when he passed away, we had 14 grandchildren.
Oh, wow.
So in the course of our 30-year marriage, we had 14 grandchildren. And they were our grandchildren. It didn't matter whose children had them, they were all our grandchildren. One of my fondest memories in Danbury, even when I lived on Town Hill and on West Street, I've always loved to read. And my dad would walk my sister and I down to the Danbury Library, which is not the library I'm sitting in now.
Mm-hmm.
The library was on South Main Street, Middle Main Street, I guess you would call it, across from the post office.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a beautiful building. I just loved that building. I loved walking in. The children's department was right as you walked in on the right-hand side, and the murals in that building of all of the characters in storybook land. I loved being there. I loved the stereopticon that they had there. That was just such a big treat to be able to go and to look at all the different foreign places and to see that. I have loved that library. And when you reached 8th grade, you could go upstairs to the big people's library. And the one thing I remember is walking up those stairs. So many people must have used those stairs that they had like a curve in them. You could, as you walked up, they were so used. And I can remember thinking to myself, so many people love to read and have come and enjoyed this library. And when you got upstairs, it was like being in church. You couldn't talk, but I was just overwhelmed with the size and the scope of the library. And then this new facility was built. Well, it opened in the 70s. At that time, I belonged to an organization called the Junior Service League in Danbury, and it was a group of 60 women who did good works in Danbury. We sponsored the Well Child clinics. We supported then Daytar, which is now Ability, and the Danbury Hospital. But we also served when there were different needs in the community, and we acted as hostesses for the opening of the library that day. Unfortunately, my youngest child was baptized that day, so that's how I remember the year and the date, but I wasn't able to come. But I remember coming and just being overwhelmed when I walked in to see the new library. And I have spent so many hours here, and I think one of the saddest things was the day the library burned. I remember I was driving to Ridgefield to go to work, and I heard it on the radio, and I remember crying. I could not imagine how anyone could burn a library. I was so sad. And for the longest time, the library was in different storefronts along Main Street, different stores that weren't being used. The owners of the buildings gave space, so if you were looking for certain types of books, you could go there. And this happened before the internet. So this happened, you couldn't download a book. You couldn't look up something on the internet. So the library being burned was a serious matter. The college was kind, and you were able to go to the college library, but it really was sad. And I think of all the things that could have happened because I lived through World War II, and nothing really bad happened in Danbury. I remember the blackouts. Remember we had black curtains. I really wasn't sure why, but everybody had black curtains, and I just remembered they were pulled at night. And I can remember having your ration books, and I still remember my mother making, and I make it, my kids love it, and probably as a child I didn't, but my mother would take Spam and she'd grind it with macaroni and cheese and mix it together. And my mom always called it, that was a war dinner. And I remember my mother making, because during the war you didn't have butter and certain things that you couldn't have. And she would have this big bowl with a big blob of white something in it. And I wasn't sure what the something was, but I knew as soon as that something softened, she was going to let me squeeze this little gel pack into this white something, and it turned this white something yellow. Well, what the white something was lard, and it made like a margarine type of a butter, and that's what we had to use during the war. I remember walking everywhere because you had gas rationing, and going to the movies right here on Main Street. There were two. There was the Palace and the Empress on Main Street, and there was another theater on Elm Street called the Capitol Theater. And on Main Street, you could go to the movies, and you'd always watch the war news because they would tell you what was happening. And as I grew older, then the Korean War, and then there was the Korean War news. We did not have television. Growing up, we had the radio, and listening to the soap operas and the Lone Ranger and the Shadow and all of the programs. And then sometime in probably early 50s, my parents got a television in our home. But when my father had funeral work downstairs, we couldn't have it on. And I can remember thinking, oh, this is terrible. These people died. Now I can't watch TV. I mean, I was, 9, 10 years old, so I really didn't realize that these people are mourning, and I'm upset because I can't watch, my programs on TV. But at that time, there were only 2 and perhaps 3 television stations. And they weren't on all day. They didn't come on until sometimes 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and they went off 10, 11 o'clock at night. It was late to have TV on. And no remote control, so you did get up and turn the TV yourself, and you sat and watched TV in the dark. The whole living room was dark. And no one ever heard of having a TV anywhere but in the living room. There was no TV in bedrooms or, recreation rooms or any of those. The TV was in the living room, and you sat as a family and you watched whatever your father wanted to watch. Whether you enjoyed it or not was entirely up to you. But there weren't that many programs to really to really watch. I remember how bad the flood affected Danbury. That changed Danbury. It changed the whole layout of Main Street and White Street, and streets that were there are no longer there because the Still River got moved and got rerouted so it wasn't coming under Main Street. And of course, the river played such an important role in Danbury. Danbury is the hat city of the world and was because the hat companies could use the river. They needed that water supply. And if you've lived in Danbury any length of time, you've heard the expression Mad Hatter, and that came from the mercury toxicity that was in the water and used in making hats. Both of my grandfathers were hatters. My mother's father was a coner, and so he was really seriously involved in his hands in and out of the mercury baths. My other grandfather, my father's father, he did the weight and measure allocations for the fur. My mom's dad worked at Mallory Hat Company, and my father's father worked for American Fur. And the furs that they used were beaver, and beaver pellets would come in, and they had to be sorted by weight and type and different types of beaver depending upon where they were being harvested from. That was determined what type, better, good grade, bad, fair. And every day at 4 o'clock, you knew where the fur factories were, because when they opened their doors, depending upon where you lived in Danbury, you could smell that wet fur. And if you've smelled a wet dog, just quadruple that with the number of beaver that were in, But along came the automobile, and men did not walk to work anymore, and so covering their head was not as important. Getting into a car, they would take their hat off because they couldn't wear their hat. They wore fedora hats, which are popular now again. But if they took their hat off and put it on a seat, and if anybody else came in the car, chances are that person either sat on it or wrinkled it or did something. So hatting went out basically because of the car. There is a story that goes around Danbury that it was John Kennedy, because he never wore a hat. He always had his hair blowing in the breeze, but really it was the automobile and the way man had just progressed to that point. The News Times always had a little small fedora hat up in the corner that said, "Wear a hat. Keep your neighbor working." In my grade school in St. Peter's, and there were 50 children in each classroom, one teacher and 50 children, and I would venture to say 40 out of that class, their fathers either were hatters or worked in the machine shops that made the machinery for hatting, like Dorn's machine, or they worked in the box shops, Danbury Box and Clark's Box, that made the boxes that shipped the hats. The rest of the other 10, myself included, my dad was a funeral director, so that was unusual. And other children in my class, their fathers might have been policemen. I know one was a doctor and an attorney, but the majority, and always, all through school, all through high school. By the time I finished high school, hatting was leaving and went south to, they went to Missouri and then they went to Texas for cheaper labor and because men were not wearing hats on the East Coast anymore. And Bardens came in, Risdens, different semiconductor companies came in and replaced the hatting industry. At one time, I believe there were 9 hat companies in Danbury, Lee, McLaughlin, and Mallory being the biggest in the world. We would have a parade in October. It was the Hat City Parade. And Arthur Godfrey, who was a commentator on TV and probably one of the biggest stars on TV and radio, would come and be in the parade, which was always a big, just such a big deal. You got the day off from school and you could go to the hat parade. And all the hat companies would have different floats in the parade. It really was. It was a very, very big deal. And then there was my favorite thing, the Danbury Fair, which got mauled in 1981. And yes, I was one of the ones that had a bumper sticker that said, "Do not maul my fair." The fair started in the last week in September, and when I was younger, it ran for 9 days. And as I grew older, the fair then incorporated the last, it ended on Columbus Day, which was a Monday, so it went extra days. But the fair was wonderful. Everyone went to the fair. If you didn't go to the fair, there was really something wrong. The Danbury schools got the day off. We got passes to go to the fair. Friday was always fair day, and I'm a practicing Catholic, and Friday, when you went to the Danbury Fair and you smelled all of the Italian places, all the cookeries from the Rosses to the Zarcones, who are old Danbury families who had stands there. You could smell the meatballs and the sausages and the peppers, but you couldn't eat meat. And finally, I think probably by the time I got to high school, the bishop gave a dispensation for those going to the fair that you could eat meat on that day, because you could tell all the Catholic kids we would get to the fair with our tuna fish sandwiches and or egg salad, depending, and but that was just such a tradition. My children miss the fair. My parents miss the fair. My dad was a volunteer fireman in Danbury when Danbury was a town and a city. Volunteer fire departments were important. The town of Danbury did not have paid firemen. The city did, but they also had volunteers. And my dad was a volunteer fireman, and the firemen had a booth at the fair that they ran bingo. And they made enough money every year running bingo at the fair. The volunteer firemen would take turns going over and working a day, working to collect the money from people playing bingo, and they made enough money to service all of the volunteer fire departments, particularly the town ones, because the town had no other fire. The city did not go to the town. And the town had no police department. It was state roads. So when you left West Street and you went up West Street and got to the top of Lake Avenue, right at that point, that's where the town started and the city ended. If you went down South Street, you got as far as well, it used to be the bus barns where the school buses were. I think there's a card store in there now, and that's where the town started. Going down toward the north end, when you got to the bottom of Claphard Ridge, that's where the town started. And you went down Paden Road, and when you turned to go to Haystown, that's where the town started. So the city was just this small little nucleus in the middle. And I believe it was 1962 that the state of Connecticut decided that that was not correct to have a town and a city government. You paid city taxes if you lived in the city. You paid town taxes if you lived in the town. It just was not a good system. And so we had to vote whether we wanted consolidation, that it would all be a city or all be a town. There are probably, and I say probably because I'm 77, there may still be some old Yankees who live in the town, out in the town areas, still are unhappy with the vote. They did not want to be part of the city. They did not, and then it changed. It was no longer 4 voting districts. It became 7, and it wasn't the same. We didn't have a selectman. We had a mayor. The city always had a mayor, but the town had a selectman. I mean, it was a silly system. It truly was. I don't know how they got away with it as long as they did. But you got some old, my husband was what would be called a swamp Yankee. He never liked the idea that we now are living in the city. We now have to pay city taxes, and we don't have city water or city sewer. So there was a big divide in town when this happened. And the first time everybody had to vote, I mean, you were voting in new places, new areas, and, change is not easy.
Right.
So I remember exactly where I was growing up in Danbury when the World War II ended. My parents, we walked down from Town Hill down to St. Peter's School, and we're standing in front of the school watching a parade, and the soldiers were coming down. Now, the peace was signed on September 1st in Japan. But it was, the peace was signed September 1st, and the parade was held here September 1st, but a day later because of the date change. And September 1st was my birthday. And I was 4 that year. And I thought this big parade coming down Main Street was just for me. And I can still see my mother and her sisters and my father. And my dad came from a very big family. He had 11 brothers. And my father's brothers, we were all there. And everyone was crying. And I can still remember thinking, why are all these people crying? This is my birthday. Look isn't this so happy? And as soon as the parade was over, and it was like so many people, and remember, I'm 4, so I'm short and I'm with a lot of people, went into St. Peter's Church to pray. And but I just remember even the men were crying. And I had no idea why. And now I know why. I know exactly why they were crying. And I remember when John Kennedy, I remember where I was when John Kennedy was shot. I had gone down to St. Peter's School to pick my nephew up for my sister. And I parked the car and I walked through Elmwood Park. There was a little store across the street, and I went in to get a pack of Lifesavers, and I met Richie Kovacs, who is a deacon at my church now, coming the opposite way, and he said to me, "Someone just shot Kennedy." And I said, "You're kidding." And I didn't even go to the store, went back to the car, and the kids started coming out of St. Peter's, and the nuns were coming out crying. And I knew it was true. I didn't know he had died yet, but I did know it was true. I knew he had been shot. And I was on Main Street on February 13th, 1970, when Danbury was blown up by the Pardee brothers. Pardee, whoever they were. I was going into Loft's candy store to pick up candy for my children for Valentine's Day. And I was pregnant with my fourth child, and I'd been at the hospital having blood taken, and came down, parked behind what was Janung's, walked through Janung's and got the candy for the kids, came back through, and I remember people saying, it's the Cubans. The Cubans are blowing up Danbury. I remember thinking, why are the Cubans blowing up Danbury? My two sons were in St. Peter's School. My youngest daughter was in kindergarten, and at that time St. Peter's didn't have kindergarten, so she was in Park Avenue School. The town was, it was crazy. You couldn't get anywhere. There were no cell phones, nothing. I went up West Street to my mother's house. My father, in the meantime, had been at St. Peter's at a funeral and had gone over to St. Peter's School and collected my two sons and my sister's two sons. So, and brought them up to my mom at the funeral home, and I kept saying, I've got to go find Betsy. I've got to go to Park Avenue and get her. And you couldn't. You could not get through. And there was no one to say, oh, well, the school buses are going to be running, or they're not running, or come and pick up your children. Finally, I was able, I walked up Park Avenue from West Street to Park Avenue School and got her. And I remember her saying to me, and we're going to walk all the way back. Yes, we are, because they let no cars go anywhere. And I was very fortunate to be at my mother's, and, my mom always had, like all good grandmothers, food and drink and everything for the kids, and then we just sat and waited. One of my mother's sisters, her husband was the president of the Union Savings Bank, and that was one of the banks that was blown up. And my uncle then was in the hospital. But we didn't know, was it serious, wasn't it serious? Because there was no communication, nothing, And you think today, somebody stubs their toe and it's either on Facebook and 500 people know about it. Now, back then, no, there wasn't any way to tell. Do you have any questions?
That was amazing.
I love Danbury. I truly do. I truly am proud to be a Danburian. I even say that I do like Newtown. I like where I live now. I go to St. Gregory's Church. I will always go there as long as the church is there, as long as I can drive there. Mm-hmm. I'm proud to be a Danbury girl.